Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the NeuroAffective Relational Model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The NARM therapist training is an advanced clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from a team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers led by faculty members Brad Kammer, Stephanie Klein, and Marcia Black. If you are working in the field of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to get trained in NARM. For more information and to reserve your spot, please visit www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Joseph McCaffrey is a licensed professional counselor and licensed mental health counselor who specializes in complex developmental trauma and ecotherapy. Joseph offers individual counseling and passionately facilitates nature-based transformational sessions. He provides workshops and intensives, as well as preparation and integration therapy for those exploring experiences of non-ordinary states of consciousness. As a clinician, Joseph's work is grounded in the NeuroAffective Relational Model, and his approach is influenced by ecotherapy, spirituality, mindfulness, and somatic work. Joseph has trained with Bill Plotkin at Animas Valley Institute in the Soulcraft Apprenticeship Initiation Program. He has also guided self-designed programs and apprenticed to nature-based soul work experiences in wild settings throughout North America. Please enjoy this conversation with Joseph McCaffrey. Okay, I'm sitting here with Joseph McCaffrey. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, happy to have you. And if it's okay with you, we'll just dive right in with that first question. What would you like listeners to get out of our interview today?
Well, I think that there's two parts, although I think it's the same thing. And the first is that we humans are of nature and of the stars, and that we are living in a world that's ensouled and alive.
That's a beautiful truth. I'm excited to dive into that further. I know I was looking at your website and there's so many interesting things. I know this conversation could go in a lot of different directions, but why don't we start with, if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are, where you come from, that kind of thing.
Oh, that's a big question. Well, where I grew up was Western Pennsylvania, which was, I think, really important to name because I was fortunate to have a childhood where I lived close to a wild place that was fairly intact. And I had a lot of opportunity and freedom to wander out from sunset to even after sundown, to lie in, the grasses of Western Pennsylvania and to look up in the stars, and not only the stars, but look at the clouds and kind of dream and be in a place of imagination, which I think is such a fundamental piece in actually what we're talking about today. But then from there, I took many different routes. I played a lot of hockey. I spent a lot of time indoors and ended up in Boulder, Colorado as a middle school teacher for some time. And I think that was such a transformational moment for me because I was teaching at schools that provided, again, a great opportunity to be outside on the land. And I started to notice two things with the young people that I was working with, that something seemed to happen when we were outside. Their behaviors changed. I was having a different experience. And at the same time, I was studying some nature connection work of John Young, and as well as rites of passage. And I started to kind of open up and awaken to a different kind of state of consciousness and a different understanding of a relationship with the wild world, which then essentially led me into counseling, where I then focused at Prescott College on clinical counseling, but also focused in ecopsychology. Yeah.
So you started out as an educator.
Yeah.
And you were already doing a lot of work outside with your students. Is that, as I understand it, or was the education kind of nature based, or?
Well, it was really, I was starting to do a lot of work outside with myself. I was studying like I was saying, John Young's work, which really is about nature connection. And I was spending time wandering and sitting in nature, and I was having these experiences that I couldn't really explain or find to read about until later I crossed Bill Plotkin's work, which we might touch into today, which helped conceptualize some things. But then, then I was teaching at expeditionary learning schools, which provided an opportunity to both be in the classroom and spend a lot of time outside. And what was interesting about that for me is that those schools were really for so-called youth at risk. But yet when we would go outside, there was something else that seemed to happen, not only with our behaviors, mine and theirs, but in the way that something seemed to shift and change in us. And I really started to get curious about that, which led me into, when I read the term ecopsychology, I'm like, oh, there's a name for what I'm seeing, although this is a much bigger idea than ecopsychology that goes back for millennia. Yeah.
Wow. So it led you into the field of counseling, and you said you spent some time in Arizona where you now reside.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how that led you to working in the field of complex trauma. And maybe you were already doing that in the educational setting and it was an easy transfer, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, it's both kind of like, I think one way to say it is that I started opening up to a deeper relationship with really an embodied cognition that not just like an understanding that I am of this greater living system that is a conscious being, but that I begin to know that on this deep cellular level. And so I think that's important to say, because about 10 to 15 years ago, when I was studying being a middle school teacher, I was learning about rites of passage. And I thought, this is something that's missing from my life. I really need this experience, this passage. What was this like pan-cultural passage from really childhood to adulthood? And I found the work of Bill Plotkin and started to dive into kind of these contemporary day rites of passage, and had the opportunity to wander out on the land and fast for 4 days and have this real, what we would call in this work, ecocentric awakening, where there was a moment in that ceremony where I experienced, I think some traditions may call like non-dual consciousness, where we call maybe ecocentric awakening, where there really wasn't a separation between me, the wind and the grasses, the sky and the earth. And I think that shifted me into such a state of being and such a state of consciousness that really my whole world changed. And I became very passionate about this work and wanted to really weave what this experience and these practices I was having on the land with counseling. And I worked some time in addiction recovery, taking folks out on the land and having these experiences. I was working simultaneously studying at Animas Valley Institute as an apprentice and really into this, what we would call depth soul work, which is in a sense different in some ways than therapy. But I began to feel that something was missing within me and in this work, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then what we're calling the pandemic, which I would actually refer to as kind of a global passage, that the earth has been inviting us into a kind of crisis that's supporting our transformation, our state of consciousness, our evolution. I had a pretty big psycho-spiritual crisis about 8 months in, where I recognize now that in some ways that the response to what was happening mimicked my own childhood trauma. And fortunately, I had worked when I was in addiction recovery with a therapist, a NARM therapist, Sherry Sharkins. And I called her up and I asked for support. And when I started to dive into NARM and understand complex trauma, that was the keystone. That was the missing piece that I saw that was missing from this transformational work on the land, and kind of bringing actually the transformational work of nature-based work, ecopsychology, ecotherapy, whatever we might want to call it, into our experience with complex trauma. Because my sense is it comes from a state of disconnection. And because, in many ways, the intention that I'm offering is provocative. Because if we actually Google the definition of nature, I actually pulled it up because I thought it was so interesting. The first definition on Google is the phenomena of the physical world, collectively including plants, animals, landscape, other features and products of Earth, as opposed to humans and human creatures. That this definition is a state of consciousness. It is a state of being in which all human organization of our society, specifically in the Western world, comes out of. That I really believe that we are in this state of, in ecopsychology, we call it like psychological estrangement from nature, this perceived disconnection that then we've learned to organize ourselves in the world. And I think that's really where I started to see how complex trauma started to dovetail into this. Because for many, many, many years, I thought all I needed to do is get people out on the land, have an experience, and everything will be okay. But if we're not connected to our hearts, if we're not connected to ourselves, how can we open up to a deeper connection with, the consciousness of the planet, with an ensouled living being? See a tree as an ensouled living being if we're not connected with ourselves. So that's where I felt that this began to kind of dovetail together, these two worlds.
I love that, how you're highlighting we can't really be connected to the earth or in relationship when we're not connected to ourselves, how vital that is. We can't be connected if we're not in our bodies and connected to ourselves.
Exactly.
Wow. So in terms of how you're bringing the work that you were already doing and bringing NARM in together, I hear that there was maybe a process of bringing them together. I'm curious what that was like.
Well, and I really will just speak through my own experience because I think that's where I'm learning about this most right now. And, just kind of going back to this world of really that Bill Plotkin introduced us to through his institute really was this way of, in a sense, mystical thinking, that a mystical state of consciousness where to open up to the possibility that everything is alive and ensouled and aware of us. And as I started to, experience that more and more, I started to have really powerful, experiences of connection where I felt more alive than I ever had. Maybe even complex trauma experiences of expansion, but then really big experiences of contraction and disconnection. Where in one moment I'm having this, what felt like this romantic, in a sense, alive, sensual experience with the wild world, and then stepping back into our society and work and then contracting. And I think, in a sense, enough became enough. I had to figure out what's going on here. How can one moment I feel so alive, so open, so connected, and in the next moment feel so closed and cut off? What's happening here?
So you were tracking.
I was tracking.
Even then, you were noticing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And although there were really beautiful models and parts work and depth psychology that's applied to animus that really helped me to start understanding the different parts of myself and my own protective strategies, my wholeness, how to be in relationship with those, like something was going on that it still was not fully integrating. The deeper aspect of myself that I was coming in touch with, this other state of consciousness, was not fully integrating.
Yeah.
And when I really started to dive into complex trauma and understand how the experiences I had as a young person and a child really led me to the ways of relating to myself and organizing my internal experience and the world around me, I really began to see, the important one, what I love about complex trauma, the importance of those strategies, how I learned to survive with them, but also be able to cultivate that internal structure, that capacity to be present and more fully into this, I'm calling it a mystical state of consciousness, this openness through my own healing. And it's just been such a powerful experience. And so I'm getting curious about it with others as folks find me who may read my website or are familiar with Bill Plotkin's work, or I also offer integration work for psychedelics. folks who find me and who are open and are curious about some of these ideas, it appears to me that there's similar patterns here of connection and disconnection, not only with ourselves, but with the world, the beings of the world, the cosmos, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in the work that you're doing as you're integrating and you're supporting clients in integration of all these experiences, I'm curious, how are you holding this idea of complex trauma? Like, how are you seeing it, I don't know, arise, or, how are you working with clients around complex trauma?
Yeah. So there was a shift for me in this before I came into NARM, and I think maybe a lot of us in this way, I can only speak for myself. I was trying to do something to or for the people that I was working with. I so wanted them to have this experience that I had, that where it was coming from in me was a place of, one, a deep desire for everyone to join the party that I was having.
Yeah.
But two, it was also coming from, in many ways, the strategies that I learned to be in the world, whether it be performing or pressuring, it was coming from that place. So really, the shift has been, in one aspect, very subtle.
Mm.
It's been really curious about actually what it is the person is wanting for themselves in relationship to maybe some of these questions or these curiosities around our relationship with the wild world, our own wildness. So that's one way, is just to really be open and present with our humanity that is arising. And when I say humanity, I think such a big part of what I'm finding in complex trauma is reconnecting to our humanity, one, our human kindness, but also the etymology. Humanity is human nature. So I think there's also a piece here that I'm just holding in my consciousness around humanity, that there could be a possibility for us to reconnect to our nature, our wildness of, essentially, our wildness of our human race. That this is, in a way, what essentially connects us all, is our wildness, is our humanity, is our relationship to the nature within ourselves in relationship to the wild nature around us.
Say more about that, the nature of ourselves in relation to the wildness and the nature.
Yeah, well, I think there's this idea in eco-psychology, and I think it also comes from evolutionary psychology, that about 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans, probably those more in the Western world and the developing world, began to psychologically estrange themselves from the wild world to try to control it. And like this definition, to be separate as, nature is something I go out into as opposed to something I am always a part of. But in that process, it really seemed to me, I'm not a historian, but it seemed to me that there was some sort of belief about our wildness, that it wasn't okay, that it was maybe dangerous or risky, that it was unsavory. And for some reason, probably a very good reason, we began to relate to ourselves in that way, that aspect of ourselves, that really our animal self, as something that's wrong with us. And what I'm really just holding in my consciousness here and working with individuals is there might be potentially another possibility in that kind of relationship with the wildness of ourself, which is our nature. And there's also authenticity, but what I love about Bill's work, there's also something even bigger than that. There's our soul. There's many ways to define soul. The way he defines it is our unique and particular place in the world, our ecological niche, that maybe there's something even deeper within us that if we open up to, maybe even have the internal structure within us to encounter, that as we embody that or learn about that, that we actually, which I think is our deepest nature, we begin to not only become alive and experience something with ourselves, but we serve all living beings. And that's when we then build a different relationship with the natural world, the world that we're in.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like I have a peach tree in my backyard. And if you think about, one, how unique everyone is, there's no one that has the same genetic makeup as me on the planet. So I'm completely unique, but at the same time, I'm completely connected. So this peach tree in my backyard is completely an individual being. And yet, when I bite into that peach, what am I really experiencing? I'm experiencing the soil that brings the nutrients into the plant, the mushroom beings that are breaking down the soil so the tree can absorb some of the minerals, the rain, the monsoons, the bees, the pollen, the air. And I mean, we could trace it back to the Big Bang. So when I bite into this peach, not only am I consuming a peach, this unique thing, but I'm also really bringing into my body and merging with something that is a manifestation of the very beginning of time. And, one might even say, it might even be a way to define love, that what I'm merging with is love in that moment.
That resonates. Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm trying to do is really embody, I mean, I can explain it, but really try to embody what the wildness in me in relationship to the wildness in the world.
Yeah.
And the poets have been talking about this forever.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sitting here with this because before we pressed record, we were both talking about how we live in Arizona. We live here in the desert. I grew up here and I spent most of my childhood running barefoot out in the yard and in trees and all of that kind of thing. And I remember as the housing developments kind of moved in, because I grew up way out in the desert, and as the housing developments kind of moved in, there was a deep grief. I was in high school when this really started, and I didn't know what was happening for me.
Yes.
I just knew I felt really sad.
Yeah.
I mean, I noticed I'd be driving down the road, and where there was just tons of desert before, there'd be cleared land now. And I remember feeling so sad about it and kind of shaming myself, like, what's your problem? Like, get over it. This is progress. This is kind of, what I mean? Get with the program, kind of a sense, sort of shaming myself around it. It honestly wasn't, until decades later when I started realizing what I had been going through, this kind of my connection with the land, with nature, was shifting because of what we as humans have been doing. And so I don't know, that just kept coming up for me as you were talking, and, you're shaking your head. So I imagine you have a lot of experience with this. Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought up grief. And if you're familiar with Joanna Macy's work, and she has brought in so much, I think, support around this for us. But what I can share is that what I've witnessed over the years is, and in my own experience, once we have this ecocentric awakening, once we have this embodied cognition that we are part of the earth, it's like our cells get it, our organs get it, right? Not just our mind.
That's
that
right.
Immediately after that follows grief. Yeah.
Yeah, that certainly was what it was. Yeah. And is, I mean, truly, because my mother still lives in my childhood home, and driving out there, I still feel that. It's like, now there's another stoplight here, and there's less land here, and there is a grief, and I'm trying to find ways to stay more connected to the land. There's less places I find here where I live. I have to go further and further out to be, really in nature. And I wonder if that's kind of part of the work that you're doing, is supporting and facilitating folks reconnecting with the land. Can you speak about that work that you're doing?
Well, yeah, and I think that there's many ways to do that, but let's just stick with grief. Because let's imagine, again, that we are of the earth, that we aren't separate. There's been this interesting phenomenon, which in many ways, I see this a little differently, that we have had this phenomenon where we see ourselves as separate. And out of that, we've created all these certain structures and systems of organization, economy, and governments. And all of that comes from this state of being, of separation, of not being part of the cosmos and the earth. And now it's interesting that here we are having an experience of grief as we are watching our behaviors in relationship to the earth. And my hunch is, and in my own experience, is the more that we can create that, at Animus we might say wholeness, or at NARM we might say our internal structure, to begin to hold the grief, to go into the grief, we're deepening into our conversation with the earth. That in that dialogue, we shift from separation into connection. Because my hunch is it's not only our grief, but it's actually a dialogue. One of the practices I love to offer folks is to wander out on the land, to invite them to imagine that everything is ensouled and alive and aware. And that if you have an encounter with a tree, a plant, a rock, some sort of being out there, that you might open up to a dialogue. Now, in my experience, often, like we have one of my greatest teachers, the alligator juniper tree, doesn't speak English. That I'm going to come back to the grief here, but that one of the ways we open up, and this was through Jung and Stephen Gallegos that I learned it, although this is a pan-cultural practice of opening up to our imagination, our senses, our feeling body, our somatic body, and our thinking mind, but really our imagination, that maybe there's another dialogue through our imagination, through our emotions and our body. And so to start to be in dialogue in that way with the beings of the earth through those, what Stephen Gallegos would talk about, windows of knowing. And so here's a bigger example that, or not, I don't know if it's bigger, but maybe a more one that's at least showing up right now, is that is the conversation, that grief is the dialogue that's happening between us and the earth. And that there's something really to learn about, that something's being communicated to us through that grief, that we can really learn not only about ourselves, but about our relationship to the planet, and maybe even our own deeper authenticity, our soul.
I love that. And I'm just thinking about, as we deepen into that grief and what's the word I'm looking for? Connect deeper in that relationship, how that, well, I'm thinking about how I was talking about it earlier. Like I have to go further out to be in nature. And I'm hearing you say, well, I mean, I don't know, this is how it's landing for me, is like leaning into that grief, letting myself feel it. That kind of is being in nature. I mean, there's a part of me that feels like if I'm connecting to that grief, that is me.
Yeah.
In the context. Is that what you're saying, or am I taking this far out there?
No, exactly. Like one of the things I've heard Larry say through NARM is that we always are in connection. And there's just this kind of, I forget exactly how he says it, I'm paraphrasing, but that there's this idea or belief that we're not connected.
Yeah.
And I would apply that here. We always are in connection with nature right now. Certainly we're in, human nature, some built form. But, there's a spider crawling on my wall. There's ivy coming through my window right now. I mean, there's the sun. I mean, we're breathing the oxygen. I mean, we are in it. We are a part of it.
Yeah.
We can't escape it, no matter what we believe.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate you.
That for our survival.
I appreciate you saying that. That's a nice shift for me to remember, because I keep having this thing, as a kid growing up, I'd step out my front door and there was the desert for miles around me. There really wasn't much else. No pavement, no streetlights. Yeah. And so I have this kind of sense of like, that's nature. And now I live in the city and I'm not in nature. And what's landing for me in this moment is, no, I'm always in it. I'm breathing the oxygen.
Exactly.
If I step outside, the sun hits my face. Like I am in it. And as I deepen into my relationship, whatever that is, if it's the grief coming up or if it's gratitude, because, wherever I'm at with it, that is my relationship with nature. So I appreciate you helping me think about that in a new, fresh way. Yeah,
because what I would say is that cities are just a manifestation of a relationship with nature.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
There's again, where does city planning, where does a building and the construction of a building come from within us? Right? It's similar to complex trauma. It's like how we relate to ourselves in the world. Is it coming from our child consciousness or our adult consciousness? When we build a building, is it coming from our consciousness of disconnection, that we are separate from nature? Or is it coming from a deep cognitive knowing that we are of the earth, that we are deeply connected to every single being, that there is no separation, that we rely on every creature, that word kin, that these are our kin, they're our kinship. And then what does a city look like? What does a government look like? What does an economic system look like? I would imagine it would be very different than what we're experiencing right now. And that is what I think, coming back to this sense of grief, the way I'm holding this through the lens of rites of passage is that every culture, as I know it, around the world throughout time, had an experience that was a conscious crisis for young people to move from childhood into adulthood, to honor who they were, to honor what they were letting go of,
Right.
and to honor what they were bringing forward into this next place, to gain a deeper understanding of who they are so that they could not only serve themselves, but the greater community, their human community and the natural community. And that has been lost.
Yeah.
We don't have that anymore.
Mhm.
And when we as a people lived in a harmonious relationship with the planet, when we live from this state of consciousness that we were of the natural world, those were when those experiences or ceremonies or passages existed. And so it's really interesting to me that now we've don't have those, and here we are in a global crisis that is ramping up. I mean, we've seen it over the last few years. The crisis on our planet and the place we live in today is ramping up. The difference in many ways is that before this was held by a set of soul-initiated elders to support young people through that. And now here we are in many ways missing that piece of it. But maybe maybe they are here. Maybe the elders are here. They might just not be they are elders in human form, but maybe that the elders are also not in human form and they're holding this. But what I'm really getting at is that my sense is that through these experiences with grief and the feelings and the emotions that arise in our relationship to what's happening on the planet is a global passage, is an opportunity for a global passage that could potentially evolve us and our consciousness into another place where we might see something different in the way we choose to organize our society.
Yeah.
Potentially. At least that's my hope.
I love what you're saying, and maybe this might seem random, but what's coming up for me right now is I've been telling you, okay, I live in the city now. And it's funny, I was driving down my street last night, and there's this neighborhood fox. There's a little family of foxes that live, and they kind of move around from year to year. I had never seen them until 2020 when everything shut down. And it's like, there was sort of this resurgent, like nature. Suddenly there were coyotes kind of wandering into town, and it was kind of beautiful. And I hadn't seen the fox in a while. And I was like, oh, I guess we're back to life. I guess, there were so many hard things about early 2020 and COVID and all of that. So I don't mean to diminish people's experiences there. But there's a part of that kind of the shutdown and sort of coming back. I have a lot of memories of standing out in my backyard and saying meta, over Zoom with people, like all these memories of sort of consciously deciding to connect with the planet in different ways. And, nature starts arising, like this little fox family that we found lives in our neighborhood. And last night, the fox scurried across the road as I was driving down. And so I'm just trying to, in this moment, I'm appreciating the reminder here that you're bringing to me. Like, what can I do to sort of protect what's around me and connect deeper with nature in the place I'm in, standing where I'm standing? That feels really important to me in this moment.
It's massive. It really is. And I think that simply beginning to spend 20 minutes to a half hour a day sitting outside. And it can be in your backyard if you're fortunate enough to have a park or a forest nearby, to sit there and to start to bring some awareness to what's happening within you and in the world around you. And one of the biggest teachers that I've found in that are the birds, the songbirds, the birds that live close to the earth, that you'll notice, and this actually, I learned stealing this from John Young's work, from his work on bird language, but it really became very true for me very quickly, that you'll begin to notice within 15, 20 minutes, maybe a half hour, that the birds will begin to go back to baseline. They'll begin to move into their normal bird behavior. You'll notice that they will come back to the ground and picking the worms out, that their songs will change, that there'll be a kind of resonance. And you'll notice this around you and even within the forest. And if you bring some attention, you might even notice that your brain waves have shifted, that something within you has shifted, that is in relationship to that baseline of the forest around you. And, you could test this out. You could get up and start singing real loudly and watch what happens. around you, and then sit back
Yeah.
down, and you can see how everything will begin to settle in a way within us and around us. And it's pretty fascinating. I was sitting once in a forest for about an hour, and I was just sitting there because there was a few deer about 50 feet away from me. And I was just really enjoying sitting there and really in that state with the forest. I mean, it was just like this absolute baseline. You could just feel the resonance of the birds and the song. And it was this completely different state of conscious state of being. And all of a sudden, there was this wave of energy that I was sitting on a log that almost knocked me off. Like I could feel this wave of energy. And what I saw first was the deer scatter. And behind them came a red-tailed hawk and a sharp-shinned hawk. And the sharp-shinned hawk was chasing the red-tailed hawk, and it swooped about 3 feet over me.
Oh, wow.
And by the time the red-tailed hawk and the sharp-shinned hawk went over me, I had already felt this wave of energy move through me. And you really in that moment, really had this like felt experience of this, such a connection. That I imagine people who hunt, who track animals, that they know this really well. They're familiar. It's like when you drop a stone in a body of water and it ripples out. That's what it's like when we walk through the forest. And I really experienced that energetically that day. And it really showed me that there's this deeper connection here that actually can be felt on a felt experience. And so, spend some time outside, see what you discover, see what you notice. And a lot may come up when we get quiet. A lot may come up that may not be pleasant.
Yeah, that grief might be popping up again. Like, hey, pay attention.
And that's what I think support is. It's like, go sit outside for a half hour and call me in the morning.
Yep. Doctor's orders. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much we're not done yet. Okay. I have one more question for you, but I'm just honoring this moment. I'm noticing my body. I'm feeling really grounded and centered. And so I appreciate you bringing these pieces to a deeper understanding for me. I'm really appreciating the invitation. So I wondered if before we closed, two things actually. I wondered if you could share, do you have any specific, you just shared a story, so maybe that's enough, but I get the sense that maybe there's something else you might have to share with us in terms of, maybe a client or even your own personal experience of struggle where your connection with nature and maybe even how you've blended it with NARM, if that feels relevant, that might help us understand more about what you do.
There's just so many things coming.
I'm sure. Yeah, take your time. We can edit time out too, so take your time.
Yeah. Well, we'll just go with it because for some reason there's a story coming to me that came early on of an experience I had where I was living in Boulder, Colorado. That's where just right at the base of that fountain formation of the open space. And I was teaching, and many times I would go for a hike when things were really difficult for me. And I was experiencing something really difficult. I had lost my father when I was 25 years old. And in many ways, that's when the world really began to speak to me in this way. And it was a messy situation. And there was, at the time, a malpractice lawsuit. And my mom was back in Pennsylvania, and she had a really difficult experience with the process, specifically around the lawyers of the hospital. Being so far away, I felt extremely helpless, extremely angry, as you can imagine, really upset. And so I went out, and at the time I had this beautiful chocolate lab named Cooper, and I walked up to the base. Many people of you might know it's Shadow Canyon, right at the base of this fountain formation. And I came around the corner, and above me sat a mother bear and a cub. And I had spent enough time outside and working with kids that I knew that I'm about 12 feet away from a mother bear and a cub. And this could be a dangerous situation.
Mamas protect their young.
Probably what I don't want to do is look into the mother's cub, because when you look into the eyes of a wild animal, it usually means you want to fight or that you want to get intimate. However, the strangest thing happened. My dog, Cooper, with chocolate lab, sat down beside me, and I gazed into the eyes of this mother cub. And it was as if she reached down into my heart, and everything opened up for me in that moment. It's all around this loss of my father, the anger I had, and I shifted into such a deep place of compassion and understanding for the lawyers, the physician, the institution. In this instant, I understood that death is an experience of transformation, of a transformation of energy, that whether we die of old age, hit by a car, if it's malpractice, whatever it may be, it's just an experience that we have going from one form to another. And I walked out of that. I walked away and I left, and I saw not only that experience, but the world differently. And what I would say now, part of what was happening is that I arrived in a different place in me. And so often in complex trauma, and the way we work with NARM is that when we start to disidentify with the ways that we organize ourselves, that we see the world, our strategies, the ways that we've had to disconnect from ourselves, the ways that we've shamed ourselves, when we start to arrive in this other place of compassion, we arrive into that day our heart, our humanity, our wild nature, to really start to live differently. And I think that moment was the catalyst, really was a threshold crossing, was a different trail that I could take, maybe even stepping off a trail into, leaving the village and moving out into the wild world. All these different metaphors really led me into encountering NARM, which now is another conversation that I'm having with not only this model, but in many ways, I believe, the consciousness of Gaia.
I just so appreciate you sharing that. I could tell you were really being thoughtful about whether that was what you wanted to share, but I feel honored that you did, because that really spoke to my heart, and I'm so touched and moved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as we come to the close of our time, I wonder if you would share with folks, how can people get in contact with your work, especially if they're local, or I don't know if you do any online, work, but we'd love to hear where we can find you.
Yeah, well, you can always find me at seedandstone.org. And, there's my email and business phone on the website. You can message me or email me. And, right now I'm doing a lot of individual work with folks. And my hope is that through the end of the year of 2023 and into 2024, that I'm going to start offering more group offerings where we might come together as a group and start to reimagine our relationship with the heart of nature, in a sense.
That sounds so exciting. I love that. Well, thank you again, Joseph. We so appreciate you taking your time and your heartfulness. Yeah. Just so appreciate the way that you're showing up in the world and the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the NeuroAffective Relational Model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The Level 2 training is a clinical training where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you learn and integrate NARM, you will receive individualized support and join an engaged professional community of therapists passionate about healing complex trauma. Learn more about this training and reserve your spot by visiting www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. The Complex Trauma Training Center emphasizes professional development in support of personal growth. We provide clinical trainings, online webinars, ongoing consult groups, mentorship programs, and community events. Our mission is to provide a relational, inclusive, and depth-oriented professional community for those seeking a supportive network of therapists working with complex trauma. To learn more about our trainings, programs, and events, please visit us on our website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.